difficult stuff, I know, and seemingly irrelevant. But this was Amos's advice to people who thought they were spiritual survivalists, as it were. Everything else had gone wrong, but here they were. Everybody else was unfaithful, they thought, but they were faithful. And so along comes Amos. And a couple of weeks ago, we heard Amos condemn the people up here away from Israel. And they said, amen. We like that. And then the people way down here from Israel, they said, ooh, we like that. And the people down here from Israel, we like that. And here from Israel, and here from Israel, and here from Israel, and even their brothers Judah from Israel. And then Amos zeroed in on them and said, you aren't being faithful to what God's told you to do. You don't act like it in society. You don't act like it, period. And so, you know what happens. Everybody said, well, who are you to say this? Who do you think you are? You're not one of our priests. You're not one of our prophets. Where did you come from? Who gives you the authority to say anything like this? Well, I want to give you a short parable, one of many I'm going to give you from modern U.S. life. Well, this isn't so modern. If you can see this picture, what you see on the screen is a famous evangelist by the name of Billy Sunday. He's the guy that's standing up on the platform next to the pulpit and pointing his finger down at the people in the audience. This guy was very athletic. He was so athletic that he would sometimes slide into home and spike the devil in order to emphasize a point. He would jump around all over. He was a former professional baseball player. And he did what people were known to do in that day, and that was to point at people. There was a 100-year-old church, probably about 150 years old now, in Ohio. And in the records of that church, they have a special office in the church. And that special office was the pointer. And they described that office by telling you that the pointer stood right next to the pastor in the pulpit, and he had this big stick. And he would say, this applies to you, Hon Kim. And then he would say, why? I said, this applies to you, Minzy. And he would say, why? He would pick people out, didn't care about embarrassing them, but if he noticed them slightly falling asleep, that was especially when he would go, this is you. And we don't actually have a pointer in our church. But today, I'm going to do my best to say, this is you, whenever I talk about this seeming obscure passage. Now, it starts right off, as Anna read for us, saying, cause these people to hear. Hear it. You need to understand that that command is a lot like things in the modern world. This is for you, person who plans to be in the military. Now, the drill instructor, the drill sergeant is in this recruit's face. And I love the caption. This is the moment when you realize that he doesn't care what your recruiter has told you. A friend of mine who lives in Georgia now, but he was in Santa Maria when I met him, he was in the Air Force. And we asked him about his experience of enlisting in the Air Force, and he said, you know, the recruiter told me about Lackland Air Force Base where we were going to be trained. And he says it's so wonderful, and they have a marvelous pool. Be sure and take your bathing suit. And he said, do you know what happened to me the first day of basic training? The DI opened up the suitcase, saw the bathing trunks, pulled them out, and said, what do you think? You're here for a vacation? And he burned the bathing trunks as an example to the rest of the recruits. They don't really care what the recruiter told you. What they're going to do is they're going to say, listen up. And of course, they also say it very profanely sometimes. Listen up. Pay attention. That's the way it ought to be. There's that time in a courtroom hearing where the judge says the defendant will please rise. And everything gets so quiet because you know the sentence is going to be passed. You know they're going to say what's going to happen. And so when Amos says, probably on the site of Bethel, house of God, that sanctuary that had been turned into a place of worship for Baal, instead of a place of worshiping God. And when Amos says, hear this, listen up, pay attention, what he means is, this is significant. What's significant? It's significant that God is going to judge. And God is going to judge everybody. And then Amos does what a lot of times people do. They use a pattern to illustrate things. Now there's a pattern here. Each line of the verses from Amos 3 through 8 begins with the same letter as another line. The first 5 lines begin with the letter Hey in Hebrew. It's pronounced and what it means is the same as our question mark. And then it has Im, which is not like the Korean last name Im. It just means if or with. And then there's the 2 keys. It's pronounced key. And it usually introduces the key idea to a passage. And then the last part of verse 8 starts off with the letter Aleph, which can't even really be pronounced except strange little sound like that. But it's the first letter in the word for lion, Aryeh, and the first word for Lord, Adonai. Now Amos uses these patterns to get attention. And he also does what a lot of preachers do, and that is asks a question from the pulpit. Essentially telling people, just answer the questions. Like a cross-examination where the witness is sweating. And the first thing he says, do 2 people travel together if they haven't agreed in advance? What it really means is, do 2 people form companionship, cooperation, without making a deal? No, it takes 2 to tango, and 2 to make a deal. Okay, Pastor, what is the big deal? So what? Well, there's an old saying that goes, you can't cheat an honest man. You see, even when we're influenced to do something wrong, we have to have some desire or some motive to do it. If somebody says, here, smoke some weed, and we say, oh, he put peer pressure on me. You must have wanted to do it. We say someone seduces someone, but if we give in, on some level we must have wanted to do it. At any point in time when we go against God's law, any point in time which we give in to temptation, we must have really wanted to do it. At some level, down deep inside, we must have wanted to do it. We can say, I was fooled. We can say, I was tricked. We can say, I was pressured. We can say, I was misled. And all of those things may be true, but there must have been some desire or motive to do it inside us. But 1 Corinthians chapter 10, 13, we read as our call to worship, said, God's made a provision for us. If we'll try to make a stand, God will help us make that stand. So when you hear that question, that cross-examination from Amos, who is really asking the people of Israel, is your faith real? Do you have an experience with God? Are you hanging out with God? You need to think about who and what influences you. As the saying goes, it takes 2 to tango. And that means watch who you hang with. Watch where you get your information. Watch where you get your advice, your counsel. Do 2 go together unless they've made a deal? And the implied answer is no. And the implied answer is watch out who you're dealing with. Now, the second question was something about a lion. Does a lion roar if he has no prey? As you can see on the poster, a Nigerian proverb says, "The roaring lion kills no prey." Why is that? Because the roar would warn the prey off. They would lose their stealth capacity. They would no longer be the fierce beast of prey. They would be starving. Now, you say, okay, it's a cute idea, Nigerian proverb, what does it mean to me? What's your point? Well, there's an old saying that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And what I want to warn you is to think about who you listen to. You see, sometimes we pay a lot more attention to people who make a lot more noise than we should. Sometimes we pay a lot of attention to those who are heard the most, to those who are read the most, to those who seem to have the most authority, to those who have the biggest following. We pay more attention to those than we do to the people of God and to the messengers of God. Sometimes those false prophets on television and radio, those false prophets in university lecterns, those false prophets on TV, those false prophets get more attention than God's real prophets. And what we need to do is we need to make sure that people have the goods before we trust them. I would never read a book on how to get rich from somebody I didn't know was rich. I would never read a book on how to get over anxiety by somebody who had breakdowns all the time. And yet, all the time, there are people that we believe without checking them out. And Amos is probably pointing indirectly and metaphorically to the false priests who are operating in Bethel. And what it says is, check out the people you're listening to. Now, it says, do traps go off by themselves? Will a snare pop up and catch a bird? If there isn't some kind of a trip, if there isn't some kind of a switch, if there isn't some kind of a mechanism. Traps don't go off by themselves. The answer is no. There is a cause and effect in life. And you're going, duh, I can learn that in elementary school science. Duh, I can learn that at the first point of the scientific method. There is cause and effect. Wow. Gee, I had to come to church to hear this. You had to claim to be inspired by God for me to hear this. What's the big deal? The lesson here is that actions have consequences. Those consequences aren't always immediate. Yeah, I got away with bad-mouthing God with my friends. Yeah, I got away with gossiping about this person. Yeah, I got away with not living up to my responsibility, my promises. Yeah, I got away with this. But they can be traps. Even when you think you're getting away with sinful actions. Even when you think you're getting away with sinful neglect. Guess what? There are still consequences. Sometimes they're consequences you can't see because you planted poison in other people's lives. Sometimes they're consequences you can't see because you've been a bad influence on someone else. Sometimes the consequences you can't see because God's waiting down the line to when He can get your attention by letting those consequences come into play. Does a snare fly up unless it's triggered? No, of course not. Can we get away with doing stuff without there being consequences? No, not at all. Now, it talks about, does a trumpet, yeah, a shofar like this guy's blowing here in the picture. Does a trumpet blow a sound of alarm and people not pay attention? Well, maybe if it was blown a lot falsely. I know whenever those tornado sirens or whatever are tested in Wilmette and in Skokie, I don't pay any attention to them because they're just testing. And even if there was a tornado coming, I probably wouldn't recognize it because I go, oh, I didn't realize today was test day. I wouldn't pay any attention. But Amos says, does an alarm go off? Does a trumpet sound and the people in the city ignore it? And does God himself speak and people ignore it? Do bad things happen without God being involved? For example, natural disasters like whirlwinds and tornadoes. We don't like to think about God allowing that to happen. But God, in his wisdom, sometimes allows bad things to happen to good people. God, in his wisdom, sometimes allows us to experience natural consequences for what we do. Whether it's causing Antarctica to melt, whether it's polluting our air so that we can't breathe, whether it's living under artificial light such that it might increase cancer. God allows sometimes our decisions to take place, but God is still in charge, and God still wants what's best for us. Now, I want to give you a non-religious parable. Does anybody know who this is supposed to be? That's Daniel. Well, that's Sean Connery as James Bond. Or this guy, still before your time, Roger Moore as James Bond. This guy, Daniel Craig, you've probably seen him as James Bond. Why am I talking about James Bond? Because the one time I met Steven Spielberg, he made a disparaging remark about James Bond. And one of his minions said, do you know why Steve said such a bad thing about James Bond in our meeting? And I said, no. And he said, well, after Stephen had directed Jaws, and after he had directed Duel, he sent a letter to the Broccoli's, the producers of the Bond movies, and he said, I'd like to direct the next James Bond. And he received this letter. And the letter said, essentially, I'm sorry, Mr. Spielberg, but no one but a British director can direct the James Bond movies. It's no longer true, but at that time it was. No one but a British director can direct James Bond movies. Spielberg was very, very disappointed. And having been very, very disappointed, it wasn't very long before he and George Lucas came up with a cool idea. You know who this is? It's Indiana Jones. And the Indiana Jones franchise for a while, and maybe even today, was more valuable than the James Bond franchise. And not only did Spielberg get to direct Raiders of the Lost Ark and all of the Indiana Jones movies he wanted to, he owned a part of them. Now, he was turned down to direct James Bond, but he created a Bond-like entity in the 1940s. And this both made more money for him and did more box office than Bond at the time, and put him on the map as having his own production company. At that time, Amblin, where I met with him. But at any rate, that's what happened. And the illustration is this. Sometimes we think people have unfairly rejected us. Sometimes we think people have unfairly said no. Sometimes we think people have unfairly treated us, but God has a plan. And a lot of times God's plan is going to be better than what we had. Now, Spielberg's a Jew, doesn't practice very much. He's not a Christian, not a believer. I'm not going to tell you that I was able to witness to him. But I can tell you, his story always stuck in my mind. Wow, if he had directed James Bond, we might never have had Indiana Jones. And there's a lot of things that happened. If I had been solely a seminary professor, like I wanted to be at one time, I would have missed out on tons of experiences that God wanted me to have and that gave me a much better life and a much more satisfying life. Sometimes those things where God says no, where it seems like God has allowed our lives to become a disaster, are preludes to God blessing us. And then we come to probably one of my favorite verses in Scripture. In the Hebrew it goes, Aryeh Sha'ag Milo Yerah. Adonai Yahweh Daber Milo Yenaveh. The first part, Aryeh Sha'ag, almost sounds like a lion roaring, doesn't it? And that's what it says. A lion roars. Who's not going to be afraid? And then the second part, the Lord Yahweh speaks. Who will not prophesy? Who wouldn't? But you're saying, I'm not a prophet. Believe it or not, that's exactly what Amos says later in Amos chapter 7. But what this verse suggests is that sharing God's promises is as natural as being afraid when dangers come into our lives. This verse suggests that when we are full of experiences with God, experiences of loving someone, experiences of having peace when everybody else is panicking, experience of having joy when everybody else is depressed and unable to move forward. When we are full of experiences with God, we can't help but share. When we are forgiven, when we are cleansed, when we get free of guilt, we can't help but share. And the question comes to mind. God's still speaking. God's speaking in worship. God's speaking in prayer. God's speaking in study. God's speaking in our service. God's still speaking. Why aren't we sharing? And the question becomes, do you spend enough time with God? In worship, in prayer, in study, and in service? Amos wasn't a prophet, but he said, when God speaks, you can't help but prophesy. Who will not prophesy? The expected answer is nobody. Everybody that hears God has to figure out how to speak and how to share. It goes on to say, preach to the palaces in Ashdod. Ashdod is on the beach. Probably not a place you'd want to live today. The ruins of ancient Ashdod are right there in the beach scene that you see on the left. And in those ruins of Ashdod must be something of the palaces and fortresses of ancient Ashdod, which was a Philistine city. The Philistines were usually the enemies of Israel. In fact, if I were to pronounce the Hebrew for Philistine, Palishtim, you would almost hear what it came to be, which is Palestinian. And Amos is saying, don't count on help from the Palestinians, if you will. Don't expect them to be allies that are going to help you out of God's judgment, God's command. And on the right side is a temple of Horus. I couldn't find palace ruins from Egypt. But these are ruins from ancient Egypt, and it says, don't depend on Egypt. Egypt used to be your enemy. Why are you treating them as an ally? Egypt used to be your enemy. Why are you trusting them? Don't expect help from the enemy. God's going to judge them too. Now, Amos, unlike a lot of you, knew what was happening on the international scene. Do you know a lot of our members don't even know who Theresa May, or Xi Jinping, or Shinzo Abe, or Justin Trudeau, or Moon Jae-in, or Michael Madigan, or Tony Preckwinkle, or Jeff Sessions might be? I don't read a newspaper, Pastor. I don't keep up on the internet. I don't pay any attention to what's happening in the world. I'm just concerned about my friends, maybe my church. But that's all it's about. A lot of our members don't even really know why Trump's in trouble or what's happening in the European Union. Why? Maybe we're so narcissistic we're just concerned about what's happening to us. Maybe we're just defeatist. There's nothing I can do about it. But Amos was up to date. He knew that the kings of Israel felt like they couldn't trust Judah, but they might be able to go past Judah to the Palestinians, the Philistines, and to the Egyptians, and they might be able to make an alliance to be strong against Assyria. And Amos is smart enough to know that alliance isn't going to work. And he speaks to it. A lot of times we think that church and we think our Christianity and our faith is just about spiritual things. But notice the people of Scripture. They are informed. They know what's happening. They pay attention. And Amos says, you can't depend on these guys. And I want to say, if you want to be relevant, if you want to share about God, you also ought to know what's going on. You ought to know what's going on in our government. You ought to know what's going on around the world. You ought to know the names of some of these world leaders. You ought to know what they stand for. You ought to know what the problems are. And so, if you're going to share God's plan and purposes, you got to know what's happening around you. Now, the problem with the Ashdod folks and the problem with the Egyptian folks was that Amos says they're not capable of accomplishing straightness. The picture here is an old-fashioned mechanical drawing technique for drawing a vertical line. You have this thing called a T-square that you slam up against your slate or up against your drawing easel so that you can draw a straight horizontal line. And then you put a triangle on top of it so that you can draw a straight vertical line. In the days before computers, that's the way we did it, folks. It was hard to do. We didn't have the computer that could connect the dots. We had to connect them by hand. Amos says, these people aren't capable of drawing a straight line. What he really means is they're not capable of living a straight line. And the big question here is whether you, by example and by sharing, are close enough to God that you must share. The consequences of not sharing. Anybody know what this is on this sewing table? There's a name for it, starts with an R. Rag. Rag's a good answer. There's a technical term that means just a little bit or a little bit left over. The word's remnant. In Israel, there was a remnant theology. They said, some of us are so special. Some of us are so loved by God that if everybody else gets punished, we're going to be okay. But the problem with remnants is they're only useful for small things. You might be able to make an athletic team pennant out of this remnant we see. You could certainly chop it up and make quilts like Mrs. Wilson is doing. But you can't make anything real and lasting and valuable in terms of clothing from what's left here. And Amos says, you're not going to get much of a remnant at all. It's going to be like when the shepherd goes out to save the lamb and all he gets are a couple of paws and a couple of legs. Or the shepherd goes out to save the lamb and pretty much all he gets is the ear. God's saying, if you don't trust, if you don't believe, if you aren't walking faithfully, that's all there's going to be of your life. That's all there's going to be of the kingdom of Israel. Amos is saying, I'm sharing with you, it's all you'll have of your life. A remnant. Do you want to just be part of a quilt? Do you want to just be a handkerchief or a pennant? Or do you want to be a robe? Do you want to be a dress? Do you want to be a coat? Do you want to be a sweater? You see, the closer we get to God, the more valuable we are and the less of a remnant we're likely to become. And the consequences of not sharing, both to God's people and to enemies like the folks in Ashdod and the folks in Egypt, is that the remnant isn't really enough. It's a very, very sad situation. And so I challenge you today with what you should do. You should worship and pray, read the Bible, and study regularly. Oh boy, news, right? No, just reminding you of what you're supposed to do. And I want you to make an effort to be informed so you aren't irrelevant. A lot of times the things I hear about evangelical Christians is they are ignorant. They don't know about science, they don't know about politics, they don't know about logic, they don't know anything. And the sad thing is, a lot of times that's true because we've said, we've got Jesus, we don't need anything else. Well, God's people are relevant. And if you're just being so irresponsible that you don't care about anything else, you're really not being all God wants you to be. Also, I want you to read and to watch and to listen. Read books, magazines, websites, watch podcasts, television shows, whatever. Listen to speakers. Listen to podcasts. So you can be fresh and interesting. The last thing that should happen with a Christian is to say, what's new? And the person says, nothing. That's false humility. Nothing's new because they don't care. Well, you could at least say, I'm reading this book, I'm binge watching this show, I'm checking out this website, I'm interested in this. Read, watch, and listen so you can be interested. And then ask God to open your eyes so that you can be faithful. Ask God to show you what you need to be doing. Because we want to make a deal where God and ourselves travel together. We want to listen to God instead of the wrong people. We want to pay attention to God, and we want to overflow so much with God that we are faithful. A lion roars. Who wouldn't be afraid? God himself speaks in his word, in his people, in that little small voice inside us. Who will not share? Let's pray.